I want to sincerely thank you for joining me for this talk. This talk is about adding acquired brain injury to the men's human rights agenda. My name is Eric Anderson. I'm a professor of sport, health, and social sciences at the University of Winchester. If you know me from previous talks, it's probably about my research on how there's a cohort effect in change of how we value and act upon masculinity. Basically, I show that younger men have a completely different construction of what is acceptable masculinity compared to older men. And there's a division there, right? But that's not what I'm going to talk to you about today. I want to add something that perhaps you haven't thought about in terms of the disadvantages that males have in society. And in this time, it's not just a disadvantage, but it is a serious harm that is caused by something that is socially praised, socially esteemed, something that we have, and probably most of you in this room have, a high level of reverence for, and that is sport. Not just any sport, but particular types of sport. But before we examine that, I want you to imagine a scenario. I want you to think for a moment about how you would feel, what do you see if you walk out onto a football playing pitch. In this case, we'll use the British version of football, right, where they kick a soccer ball around, right? So you walk out onto a soccer pitch and you see two groups of men, and one side is all black and the other side is all white. How does that make you feel? What do you think about that, right? And then the second scenario is you walk out to the same pitch for the same sport the same day, but this time there's a mixed race group of, black people and white people playing another team that is black people and white people. And how does that make you feel? Now, in some capacity, you probably thought, something's not right here. In the first scenario, there seems to be segregation at play. And how does that come to be? Is it just because they happen to live in district areas, and aren't different areas sort of influenced by race in the first place? It might just set up some question marks in your head. Right? In the second scenario, you walk out and you see mixed men of mixed race playing men of mixed race, and you think nothing of it all. You just simply go, there's football. That's the way most people would see this. Now, what if you walk out and you see women playing other women, again, with mixed race on both sides? Is there any segregation there? Does it make you feel different, right? There's a women's team A and women's team B, and people of different races on women's team A and women's team B. Is there any discrimination occurring here? Is anybody being harmed? Is there anything negative? And you don't see it. And you don't see it, most of you, because for the most part, it's not something that's ever been highlighted to you. It is a blatant example of gender segregation. It is segregation of team sport by gender. Now, I know that my audience, for the most part, is probably not in favor of integrating men's and women's sports. And whenever that proposal is brought up, they say things like, well, how could a woman take a hit from a man in football, right? They always jump to the most extreme example. But I want to look for a moment and ask the question, like, how are women disadvantaged by this? And most of you will immediately think to the arguments that feminists have put forward. And some of those arguments concern the fact that women don't get paid the same for the same achievements in sport. And of course, the counterside to that is, well, their achievements are a lot easier to get. There's fewer women playing at the competitive level. They don't play at the same level as men. And it's a free market. It's capitalist driven. If women if women want to unionize and create their own leagues and try to charge as much for ticket entrance and for advertisement to make the same revenue, to pay the women the same salaries as men, go for it. It's a free market, right? But there's something else that I want you to see from this. Because outside of the normal debates, there is a serious disadvantage that hurts women when it comes to this sort of division in sport. Gender segregation, the hidden disadvantage for women. And that is not in the playing of sport, and that is not in the salaries that come from sport, but I want you to think for a moment about the sporting institution. The sporting institution which employs a very large number of people in all sorts of realms, right? And so we might be looking at sports journalism, we might be looking at managing a sports complex, we might be looking at a team manager, we might be looking at coaching teams, we might be looking at the physio or other experts that consult with teams. There's all sorts of employment around. It's a multi-billion pound industry to enable sport at the professional and the lower ranks to operate. And there's a serious disadvantage for women here. And that disadvantage is that men play in their own fields and women play in their own fields, and men get to know each other and make social networks that then leads them to have an advantage in employment in the occupational systems, right? Plus, we value team sport athletes more than individual sport athletes when it comes to hiring in the corporate world. So you might then go, okay, well, there might be a disadvantage if women play less competitive team sports than men. So let's look at the rates of participation in rugby, for example. Let's begin by looking at ages 11 to 16. Now, that's about secondary school, right? There are currently 1,080,000 boys playing rugby at that age, right? And that is out of about 1.5 million boys that are of that age, right? And there's considerably less, about 2/3 less, 420,000 girls playing sport at that age. So immediately there's a disadvantage here. Boys are playing sports that lend to occupational advantage in later years. But wait a minute. There's a drop-off between ages 11 to 16 and ages 16 plus. So maybe in rugby there's not that much of an advantage. Okay, it's still a pretty big number, right? So 238,800 males playing either rugby league or rugby union in England, okay, compared to 46,000 females. Again, women playing about 25% as often as men in the sport of rugby. So there's more men, that gives men an advantage in occupational employment, right? But what about the disadvantage? What about the disadvantage to the fact that more men are playing rugby? And obviously, because you saw the title of this talk, you know where this is going. So before I ask you about the male harm from this, let's first ask the question, how on earth can rugby screw it up so bad that up to the age of 16, there are over 1 million children playing, and from the age of 16 to 100, that number drops dramatically to 1/4 of its former self, like that. What's happened here? What is the reason that participation rates for 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds, let's go with 15-year-olds, about 1 million children, male children, play tackle rugby up to the age of 15, but at the age of 16, that number drops to far less than 238,000. I don't know what the exact number is, but it drops to, a shell of itself. In fact, the percentage of males who play competitive rugby from age 16 plus in England is 0.1%, right, of the population. So incredibly low. So what has gone wrong here where there's such a huge drop-off? Well, that huge drop-off in participation figures might make you go, this doesn't sound cultural. Do people suddenly dislike a sport overnight? And in fact, it's not cultural, and it is specifically a result of compulsion. Boys in England and across the United Kingdom in secondary school are compelled, even against their will, to play tackle rugby. All right? Now, that's a big statement, right? Most people, they refute me when I say this. They say, oh, no, they're not. Come on. It seems so ludicrous that boys would be compelled, even against their will. In fact, even against their parents' will, to play tackle rugby. It just seems like a non-starter in terms of an argument. So how did I come to this position? Well, this is through a process of research. What we did is we got 288 schools from across England, and we got a returned academic piece of research from them as a part of a freedom of information request. Now, this was great because one of the problems with academic research is trying to get a decent response rate. But a freedom of information request, they are, because they're public entities, they're required by law to respond. So we got the phenomenal response rate. At any rate, of the 288 secondary schools across England, representing 9.1% of schools in England, 229 of those indicated that they play rugby. And of those 229 that play rugby, 208 schools compel boys to play it. Compel. Compulsion. I want you to think about that for a moment. They are compelled. Now, you might think, no, come on, by what mechanism could they be compelled to play rugby? First of all, it's the playing of rugby in PE. We're not talking about playing rugby on the Saturday for the Rugby Football Union. We're talking about physical education class using sport as a modality to achieve, quote, physical education, inclusive of tackle rugby. And this begins in this country for children from age 11. And why is it compulsory? Because the home school contract requires it to be so. In fact, one of our questions to the heads of PE was, what do you do if someone says, no, they're not going to play rugby? Or what do you do if a parent says they don't want their child to play rugby? And the response was, you make them do it. It's compelled. Now, it's not compelled by British law, but part of the PE recommendations have rugby in it, and through history, rugby is a highly played activity, as 229 out of 288 schools shows, and in that capacity, they are compelled to play it. Now, if you give them the fact that there's 1.5 million boys of that age, that means about 1,080,000 boys are compelled to play rugby, even against their will. And even if you like rugby, right? I'm not saying rugby's not fun to watch. I don't like it. But, perhaps you enjoy watching rugby. Maybe you enjoyed playing rugby. But the compulsion element to this argument alone is probably enough to scare you. I mean, think about some other things that males are compelled to do. For example, how many of you in the audience believe that boys should be circumcised against their will? That children who are circumcised without any choice in the matter? Now, I'm not talking for medical reason, right? Our community, the Men's Human Rights Association's community, we're hugely against that, right? And rightfully so. It's genital mutilation. Boys should not be compelled to have their genitalia mutilated. What about compulsion into military service through a draft or selective service? The history of the draft, which occurred after World War I, right? Particularly in the States. I know the States data. I don't really know English data that well here, guys. Sorry. But in America, after World War I, selective service came into play, and people were compelled to partake in the Second World War, as well as there was a draft, obviously, in Vietnam. Now, should people be compelled to partake in the military against their will, to fight and die against their will? There's an argument to be had there, but probably none of you would disagree that if people are to be compelled, then to only compel males into this and not females is obviously a form of female privilege, right? It's a form of gynocentrism, isn't it? And it's horrific. Now, this is beginning to change. There was a court order, a federal court order in the United States that basically said the next time there's a draft, and there probably never will be, but that women would also have to be drafted from men, because it is sexism to compel boys to do something and not girls. So, what about in the case of compelling children to play tackle rugby? Boys are compelled, and yes, girls are also compelled. But those rates of compulsion for women are a fraction of what they are for men. Some schools compel girls to play tackle rugby. Most do not, right? Most schools, on the other hand, do compel boys to play tackle rugby. And that highlights that this rugby playing is not just a matter of institutional creed, it is a matter of cultural reverence. People believe that boys need to learn to be rough and tough and to smash themselves together for the sake of masculinity. And I have a problem with that. Now, I know that not all of you are going to agree with me, right? From my perspective, right, if I've upset somebody, then I've done a good job. Because if you all agree with me, then what's the point of listening to me? Well, what's the point of listening to something you already agree with, right? So I know that many of you won't agree with me, and you'll think that boys do need to learn that type of physical injury, pain, sacrifice, violence against the body in order to, I don't know. It's not an argument I buy in the slightest, right? But the point is, our cultural reverence for it has compelled the participation for boys. And this is a different type of compulsion than saying, well, one of the arguments I hear is, well, boys are also compelled to take math. Well, yes, so are girls. And boys are also compelled to, take history. Yeah, and so are girls. But why is it boys are compelled to play this incredibly violent sport and girls are only compelled to do it to a fraction of the percentage of males? To me, that is discrimination. That is discrimination against the male body and discrimination against the male brain. Now, what do I mean by discrimination against the male brain? You hear my dog? He just won't stop barking. And he's only like this big too. I think he's got a Napoleon complex. At any rate, I'd like to challenge you all. Take your iPhone and maybe against the wall or a brick or throw it up in the air and have it land on a tile floor. And do that maybe 2-3 dozen times over the course of the next hour. All right? Go ahead. Yeah, do it. And the reality is, you won't do it because it's going to end up looking like this iPhone, which is to say it will break. And there's a certain logic that comes with physics that if you bang something hard, you'll break it, right? Well, what about the brain? If you bang the brain hard, does it break? And in fact, it does. And so a fundamental question I have for you is, why is it we are not willing to bang our iPhones, which can be replaced, but we are willing, not all of us, but many are willing to have our children's brains banged, which can never be replaced? Now, how often are those children's brains banged? I can't tell you in PE what percentage of boys in PE receive a concussion. I can't do that. And that's because there's no data on that. And that's because, believe it or not, if a child gets a rubber burn or a paper cut in class, it has to be logged. But things that occur in PE do not need to be logged. Injuries that occur as part of PE do not need to be logged unless a child is admitted to hospital. So we have no data on how many concussions there are for our children in this country as part of school's PE. Now, you might think, yes, Eric, we'll just look at the hospital admissions logs. I mean, if you got a concussion, you should go to the hospital. But wait a minute. The vast majority of concussions are not diagnosed. And from those that are suspected, right, very few are taken to hospital. In fact, for the most part, people still consider getting your bell rung an acceptable practice. But getting your bell rung is not an acceptable practice. It is a sign of traumatic brain injury for which there are lifelong consequences because the brain does not repair itself. Now, what this tells you is that the only way we can determine when a concussion has occurred is by some sort of symptomology, because there's no saliva test, there's no blood test, there's no measurable way for us to know whether somebody's had a concussion. You can't put monitors on their heads and so forth. None of these things work, or there's all been tried, jaw things and all sorts of stuff. We can't even tell you at what level of G-force a concussion will occur, and that's because there's great variance in there. But what we do know is that by the time a concussion produces enough symptoms, it is a serious form of brain trauma. Not a mild form, but a traumatic brain injury by the time you have symptoms from that, quote, having your bell rung. So let's have a look at some of the rates of injury that come from rugby. So this is a study taken from those who play rugby as part of a community rugby league. Now, they have an advantage in warding off concussions and capacity here because they are better trained, right? They're better trained in all capacities, and they're probably better weight matched. But in PE, and my kids go to a school where they begin playing rugby aged 8. Now, fortunate for me, it's a private school and they're not compelling the children to play it, so my children will not be playing rugby from age 8. But if I didn't have the agency or the knowledge and the agency to say to the headmaster, not a chance are my kids doing that, as so many other parents won't, then what you have is a child like one of mine, who is the shortest in this class, with his best friend, who is that much taller than him and probably 10 kilos, 20 kilos more at the same age, colliding in sport, right? And you might think, oh, come on, children of that age, they don't bring enough force to cause collision. Well, here's a fun fact for you. 2 8-year-olds or 2 16-year-olds or 2 professional rugby players colliding all have the same G-force, all have the same concussive capacity. And that's because, yes, the professional rugby players are bringing in more power, more movement to collide with another person. On the other hand, they have more musculature, and particularly neck musculature, to absorb some of that impact before it gets to the skull. The younger the children, the less power they derive, but also the less musculature there is to prevent the concussion. So with the concussion being equal for impact from children and adults, children are at a distinct disadvantage, particularly at the youth age, right? I'm sorry, all children are youth, but their brains are in a developmental stage. So, between 8 and 13 is a hugely significant part of the brain's development. And to have children tackling in that brings extra problems that adults don't face. So, with rugby players who are under 18 years of age, and this is schools rugby, right? So these are people who play for schools, but they've got a coach on the side kind of thing. The rates of injury, full stop, not just concussion, but the rates of injury for rugby are phenomenally high, right? So compare it to both ice hockey and American football, and you can see that rugby has, much higher rates of overall injury. It is a ballistic, violent collision sport, right? Now, what about concussion? So in a study that examined youth again, this time specifically for concussion in rugby, they found that there were 426 injuries of 825 players followed throughout just one season of play. In other words, 25% of children who played rugby for one season were out of the sport for 28 days because of injury. There were 81 concussions. That's 10% in one season. In one season of play, there were 81 diagnosed concussions, right? So how many traumatic brain injuries occurred that we don't know about for this population? Now, that might be startling for some of you. For others, you might think, of course, right? This is 2 bodies colliding over and over again in precarious positions. Yeah, of course. And they're not even wearing helmets. Well, let me put the brakes on that one for a minute, because actually, helmets don't make it better. Helmets, in fact, make it worse. And that's because what a concussion is not the skull being hit. A concussion is the brain hitting the skull. In other words, imagine a car crash. The first collision is the 2 cars collide. The second collision is your body colliding against the steering wheel. And the third collision is the one that kills you. It's when your organs collide against the skeletal system or your brain collides inside the skull. That's the danger here. And putting a football helmet on, putting an American style football helmet on, it spreads the shock out so you don't fracture the skull, right? But it doesn't stop the brain it doesn't slow the brain down in its slam against the skull. So it has zero impact, no impact whatsoever in protecting the brain from concussion. And in fact, it makes it worse because the minute you put a helmet on, you feel like empowered, right? And then people start hitting harder. And because they don't get blood, they don't get little fractures to the skin to pull them out of the game, they're in the game for a longer period of time, right? So there's no way we can helmet our way out of this problem. If two bodies collide, helmeted or not, pads or not, the brain goes from a rapid the brain goes through rapid deacceleration, and that's where the collision occurs. So rugby is a highly injurious sport. It is a highly injurious sport in terms of concussion, right? It's not the only form of abuse that occurs in rugby. And I'm not even talking about all of the musculoskeletal injuries. Because people who play rugby, they sign up for that. They kind of know that, don't they? They know that you can break limbs, right? And they know that you can have all sorts of other musculoskeletal injuries. They don't readily know that, one of those torn ACLs that they think that they just had operated on and then they're going to get back in the game so many months later and that they're fine. You might be fine when you're 19 years old, but when you're 50 years old and 60 years old, you're not fine, right? And even before that, actually. Because all sorts of arthritic conditions come into play from the injuries that were suffered in one's folly of youth. And rugby players sign up for that. They know that, right? But what they don't know and what they're not informed about is incredibly high rates of concussion. Now, just like those musculoskeletal injuries come back to harm you when you're older, so do concussions. There is a myth, there's a belief out there that, you get a concussion and then you take your time away and the brain recovers and then you go back to normal. There is no normal post-concussion. The brain doesn't heal itself. One concussion is damage for life. Now, to highlight this, Sweden did a study where they took 200,000 matched pairs of siblings, so that in doing this, you're controlling for the environment, right? You're controlling for socio-cultural aspects, you're controlling for nutrition, you're controlling for everything, right? What they did, though, is they looked at those who had a concussion from that matched pair sibling to those who didn't. And I believe it was 38,000 had a concussion. And they found that individuals who had one substantial concussion, well, we know it's substantial because it was diagnosed by, went to the hospital and was diagnosed, so, traumatic brain injury. Individuals who had one substantial concussion had far worse outcomes on life measures. They had higher rates of criminality, they had higher rates of depression, and they had higher rates of reliance upon the state for financial sustenance. That's a serious problem, right? And that's just from one concussion. So this belief that we get concussed and then we move along and we get over it is simply not the case. One concussion can cause serious lifelong impairment. But the second type of impairment we call post-concussion syndrome. Now, post-concussion syndrome can be fleeting. It can exist for an ephemeral period of time, or it can exist for the rest of one's life. And that has to do with motor neuron disturbances. It has to do with balance. It has to do with fatigue, lack of memory, depression, anxiety, anger from one concussion. Now, we don't know why it is. I hear from people all of the time, they had one concussion and they've been symptomatic with all sorts of problems for months or years ever since. And there's no treatment. There's no solution. There's treatments for, right? So anti-anxieties for the depression and things of that nature, right? And we can get some of the motor skills back by going to therapy, right? And there are some therapies to try to get the brain to rework some of those connections. But for the most part, it's like a car that's been in a major accident, right? You can unstretch it and so forth, but the alignment is still always going to be off. And that's the way I prefer to look at post-concussion syndrome. That's not something people hear about very often. What they do hear about, hang on, I'm going to skip forward. Tell you what else they don't hear about. They don't hear about the cognitive neurodegeneration that occurs from playing contact sports without concussion. That's a new one for us. That's actually sort of a new one for scientists overall. So let me repeat this. This is a form of brain damage that occurs not from concussion, but from subconcussive forces that the head undergoes as a regular and routine part of many sports. So in the case of rugby, it's the daily tackling. In the case of football, i.e. soccer, it is heading the ball, right? Headers in drill. So we know, for example, we know that there's a bit of a problem. So we do a series of 10 headers, just throw the ball and have the 18-year-old head the ball back to you, and we measure delay in neurological activity and in memory, and yeah, there's a day-long effect where their memory goes down and their speed and accuracy of things goes down. So there's a problem there. But the repetition of that causes a disease that is known only so far to team sport athletes, and that is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Now, I've got a slide here for you that shows you the 4 stages of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It's characterized by what we call tau proteins, and there's an accumulation of these tau proteins in the brain, and there's no cure and there's no medicine and there's no coming back or recovery from. It's a progressive disease. I think the scary thing here is it can only be diagnosed post-mortem for now. And they are working on some modalities to try to diagnose in the living. And as soon as they do that, then that's the end of contact sports. Because what we're finding from people who've died from other things, car accidents or whatnot, or cancer or whatnot, that the stage 1 and stage 2 CTE is found even in 18-year-olds. And so there's a fantastic documentary on Aaron Hernandez, as an American NFL player who committed a homicide and he's in jail. If you've got Netflix, watch it. It's an interesting dynamic between whether his homicidal aggression was a result of his being a closeted gay man. I suspect not. Come on, really. How many gay men kill people? You ever hear any gay gangs, right? When you think about gangs of Chicago, and gay men really do those sorts of things? We're far too smart for that. All right, I digress. I know that some gay men have killed, right? But my point here is that it is probably violence that's been brought on by chronic traumatic encephalopathy. He was diagnosed with, I forgot whether it was stage 3 or stage 4 CTE, even though he was very young upon autopsy. And so it's basically like a cancer that spreads across the brain, and it has a large number of negative impacts on the individual. So there's some stages to this, and you can look at the photo there and you'll see stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. And stage 1 might be asymptomatic, right? You might not feel anything at all, but you might also have short-term memory deficits. They tend to be mild, they tend to be short-term, and you might also have depression. And I think depression is the hallmark of this stuff. And as a social scientist, we used to look and say, why do American NFL players, American footballers, why do they have such high rates of violence and depression and suicide and drug abuse? And we used to theorize, it's because, it was all about them when they were a professional player. But the minute they retired, it wasn't all about them anymore, and they reeled from the lack of their identity and all of that, and then they turned to drugs, and no, it isn't that. It's biological disease brought on by brain trauma. So, stage 2. Behavioral outbursts, violence, particularly violence against women. Now, we don't know if that's violence against women because it's only women who they're reporting the violence to, or because it's proximity, because the men are mostly straight, obviously, and they take it out on their partners. But, certainly violence. And then an increased level of depression, right? A higher intensity and longer depressive episodes. But by stage 3, we start to get to cognitive deficits, including memory loss, executive functioning deficits, visuospatial dysfunction, and apathy. Right? People just start to lose the will. And this is when families tell us, I'm doing research on families of men who have CTE, that they lose, like their lover, their son or their husband goes from being, just sort of having some problems to they're not them anymore. They don't recognize them anymore. Their level of violence escalates, their level of depression escalates, that they begin to say that, he's gone. They don't recognize it as a disease. They don't know it for the most part it's a disease until most recently. And when people find out that their deceased loved ones had CTE, it comes as a great relief because they know that it wasn't them changing, it was the disease changing them. Right? But before we get to stage 4, I want to back up a minute and say that there's also a high rate of young male suicides immediately following concussion. Now, suicide is a very complex behavior, and I know many of you here are interested in that. And I certainly know that you're interested in the link between having your children taken away and suicide. But that's not the only link. If we truly care about preventing men from committing suicide, we need to realize that concussion is a hallmark of suicide for team sport athletes. So not just team sport athletes, but people who have a concussion. There's a window period, and it's not long, a couple of weeks, much higher rates of suicide. So we need to be cautious there. At any rate, by the time you get into advanced stages of the disease, then you have all sorts of problems. Language deficits and paranoia and motor deficits, Parkinson's syndromes, and all sorts of neurological problems that you can imagine happens with Alzheimer's and dementias and those sorts of things, right? So I want to ask you, right, isn't it interesting that CTE is this disease that only appears for team sport athletes? But is it the only neurological disease that team sport athletes, collision sport athletes, have higher rates of? And the answer is no, it's not. So here in the United Kingdom, some researchers have recently examined ex-football players. So by this I mean soccer players, right? And here's what they found. They found that they had 500% increase in dementia compared to the general population. 500%. Now I want you to think about something, about when you compare men, right, who've played football to the general population of males, and you see 500% increase, 5 times increase in those reporting dementia compared to the statistics for every 100,000 in the general population. But that general population is a highly football-obsessed culture, right? Most people don't make it to professional level, but most boys play for years. So, what are the probabilities that collision sports, including football, which is the most played sport in this country, is related to, not through correlation, but through causation, to depression and suicide more broadly for males, to all sorts of other impacts that we know that males have. We know that, for example, males have higher rates of criminal violence outside the domestic sphere, right? Now, we know that violence is an offshoot of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So these numbers are quite scary to me. 500% increase. Now, there's another number there, 40. And that's because there are now hundreds of brains that have been donated to the Boston Brain Bank from American football players. And what those brains show is that statistically, if you model the percentage of brains they have versus how many ex-NFL football players there are out there, then the minimum number of NFL players that will have chronic traumatic encephalopathy at the time of death will be 40% minimum. That's some scary shit. 3.5. That is the scariest number, because we are now able to do dose response studies. There's enough brains at the Boston Brain Bank that they can do this. 3.5 years or 3.5 seasons of play of American football, which has less concussions than rugby, brings twice the chance of getting chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Just 3.5 years. Now, I said that our children are compelled to play tackle rugby in school systems from age 11 to 16, 15, right? Secondary school. 11, 12, 13, 14, that's like 5 years. I think that's how long secondary school is. I should know, I've got young kids. At any rate, now, I know that that's not full seasons, but you add that up and you're getting close to that mark from that sport alone. That doesn't include football, which is also compelled in school systems. So What we have now, we know we've got concussion and the problems, the lifelong problems that come with that. We've got post-concussive syndrome. We've got various forms of cognitive neurodegeneration. We're also learning that concussion breaks the blood-brain barrier. This is the latest research front here, and that allows more viruses through. So contact sport athletes have higher rates of illness from viruses breaking the blood-brain barrier. But what is the Rugby Football Union concerned about, right? What's their primary thing? And that is second impact syndrome. And don't get me wrong, second impact syndrome is serious and it's a real problem, right? In fact, the day I'm filming this, a 25-year-old died yesterday from second impact syndrome. And basically what that is you have a concussion on the field, and if you don't pull yourself out and you get hit again, there's a considerably elevated rate of death on field. And loads of kids have died this way, young kids, older kids. And it happens not just in rugby, it happens in fight sports, etc. And that's called second impact syndrome. And second impact syndrome gets the lion's share of the Rugby Football Union's attention by saying things like, recognize and remove. So this problem extends more broadly. It extends to servicemen because shooting the gun, CTE. It extends to downhill mountain bikers, right? It extends to all sorts of sports that jar the brain. But my big concern here is the compulsive element of getting children to do these things, to do these incredibly brain-damaging sports, even against their will. And so I want to wrap up here by suggesting that this is not just an issue for men's human rights associations, that this is a matter of child abuse. Now, that's a loaded concept to say that children playing rugby is child abuse. Certainly compelling them to play rugby is child abuse. And you all know that there's 4 domains of child abuse. And the domain that I'd call this would be both physical and neglect, to be honest. A child abuse is a damage. It's a damage caused from one child or an adult to another that is preventable. And how can we not say that brain trauma as a result of rugby and heading the ball in football is not intentional? And if it's intentional, then it's physical abuse. Now, the whole Western world is beginning to understand this disposition. When I started taking this perspective about a decade ago, I was a heretic. I was ridiculed by fellow sports scholars. I gave a talk to the European Congress of Sport last summer, and I called it child abuse. There was no disagreement. We've moved on. We know this now. In fact, you'll probably know that as a result of that football study, football for children in this country is now they're not permitted to head the ball up until age 12, and then it's sort of progressed in, right? And so that's better, right? Especially since there's large dropout rates of kids. But I just want to leave you with this. The idea that we compel boys into head traumatizing, brain traumatizing activities is child abuse. And there is no safe way to do this. People often say, oh, you just need to teach tackle properly. No, that's not true. That's absolute and total rubbish. I ask people this. They say, oh, hit higher, hit lower, hit here, hit there, tackle there. The Rugby Football Union is constantly changing the way that they get kids or adults to tackle. But, it has no impact, right? It just, who gets more of the blunt of the force? The reality is 2 moving objects hit. That's a tackle. Someone's brain is going to get tackled in that capacity. Because children are compelled to do this at far higher rates than women, I think that this is a serious issue that needs to be addressed by this community. There's no safe way to play tackle rugby. But we could remove the tackle and make it touch, make it tag, make it flag, make it ripper. And in doing that, we do away with the problem of my smaller child and his bigger friend. In fact, we even can play a gender mixed game. So from my perspective, this proposal is something that both feminists and MRA should get along on. Let's stop banging our children's brains, regardless of sex. Let's make sport more fun and less dangerous. Thank you very much.